That's an unauthorized modification, Mr. Turner. I'm issuing a $500 fine, and if that flagpole isn't gone by Monday, I'll have it removed at your expense and place a lien on your property for the cost. The voice, a grating symphony of entitlement and stale cigarette smoke, sliced through the perfect morning stillness. I turned from the rosebush I was pruning, my hand still holding the clippers, and saw her. Karen, the president of the Oakmont Estates Homeowners Association, stood on my lawn, her considerable frame squeezed into a powder blue tracksuit that screamed defiance against both fashion and physics. She had a clipboard clutched in one hand and a tape measure in the other, a self-appointed field marshal inspecting her territory. My territory. She had crossed the invisible but sacred line of my property boundary, a line I had spent 25 years of my life professionally trained to secure. My heart rate didn't spike, it dropped, settling into the cold, steady rhythm that always preceded decisive action. My gaze flickered from her smug face to her feet, planted a good 10 yards inside my lawn, then to the American flag waving gently from the pole I had installed just yesterday. It was a modest pole, a tribute, a quiet promise I had made to men who never came home. "Karen," I said, my voice low and even, "you are trespassing." She scoffed, a little puff of air that ruffled the chemically stiffened helmet of her blonde hair. "It's not trespassing when I'm conducting official HOA business. Article 4, Section B of the bylaws. I have the right to inspect any property for violations." I took a slow step toward her, my peripheral vision cataloging everything. The open garage door behind me, the heavy-duty Maglite on the workbench just inside, the neighbor's window, curtain twitching, the way her eyes, small and hard, darted around, looking not at me, but for her next infraction to document. "You have the right to inspect from the common areas," I corrected her, my voice still quiet, but now carrying a different weight. "You do not have the right to enter my property without my explicit prior consent. You don't have it. You are, by legal definition, an intruder." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, quickly replaced by indignation. "Don't you take that tone with me? I am the president of this association. I will have you know—" I didn't wait for her to finish. I turned, walked the 15 feet to my garage and stepped inside. My hand closed around the cool, reassuring weight of the 4D cell Maglite. It was a solid club of machined aluminum, heavy and balanced. In my line of work, we called it a compliance tool. I clicked the beam on, a blinding white circle that cut through the morning shadows. When I turned back, I didn't walk toward her. I walked along the edge of my driveway, my movements deliberate, my posture erect. I was no longer Jack Turner, the quiet retiree who grew roses. I was Special Agent Turner of the Diplomatic Security Service, securing a perimeter. I walked the property line. The beam of the flashlight pointed at the ground just in front of my feet, marking the boundary she had crossed. I didn't look at her. I didn't speak to her. I just walked. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the soft thud of my boots on the pavement and the rustle of the flag overhead. When I reached the corner of my property by the street, I pivoted with military precision and began walking the front edge, the beam still tracing the line. I could feel her eyes on me, her outrage curdling into confusion, then into something else. Fear. The sight of a man, calm and silent, methodically securing a boundary with a heavy, dark object in his hand, had an effect that shouting never could. When I completed the circuit and stood once more on my driveway, I finally turned the light on her. The beam caught her full in the face, washing out her features in a harsh, interrogative glare. She flinched, throwing a hand up to shield her eyes. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "That's it! I'm calling the police! You're threatening me!" "My light is on my property, Karen," I said, the words cutting through the air. "You are on my property. You are the threat. You have 10 seconds to remove yourself before I take further measures to mitigate that threat." I started counting, my voice as flat and final as a judge's gavel. 10, 9, 8. She stared, momentarily paralyzed, a deer caught not in headlights but in the focused beam of pure, unadulterated consequence. At 7, she broke. She scrambled backward, tripping over her own feet and nearly falling, her clipboard flying from her grasp. She didn't stop to pick it up. She crab-walked backward until she was on the sidewalk, then lurched to her feet and half ran, half waddled down the street, shouting something about lawyers and assault and how I would be hearing from the board. I clicked the flashlight off, plunging the world back into the soft morning light. I walked over, picked up her clipboard, and glanced at the sheet. It was a pre-printed violation form. In the space for violation description, she had scrawled, "aggressive and unapproved flagpole installation." I almost laughed. This was the moment the war began, and she had just handed me her battle plans. This wasn't just about a flagpole anymore. It was about a bully who had finally pushed the wrong person. She thought her bylaws were the law of the land. I was about to teach her about the actual law, the one that couldn't be twisted by a committee of petty tyrants in a clubhouse. If you're watching this and you've ever had your own HOA nightmare, hit that subscribe button and tell me your story in the comments below. I want to know where you're watching from and what battles you've had to fight. Because trust me, this was a battle, and I was just getting started. I went back inside, laid the clipboard on my kitchen island next to her abandoned tape measure, and started a pot of coffee. The game was afoot, and I knew exactly how it was going to end. To understand why a simple flagpole could detonate my quiet, carefully constructed retirement, you have to understand where I came from. For 25 years, I wasn't Jack Turner, a guy with a green thumb and a penchant for strong coffee. I was Special Agent Turner, Diplomatic Security Service. My job, in the simplest terms, was to keep American diplomats and embassies safe in the most dangerous corners of the world. My reality was armored Suburbans, threat assessments, motorcade logistics, and the constant, humming tension of being a target. I lived and breathed perimeters, access control, and the subtle art of de-escalating a situation before it required a kinetic solution. My weapon of choice wasn't always a firearm. It was often a well-placed camera, a meticulously researched background check, or a calm, authoritative voice in a chaotic room. I'd spent a decade in places where a poorly worded sentence could get you killed faster than a bullet. When I retired, my wife Sarah and I chose Oakmont Estates for one reason: peace. It looked like the American Dream brochure: manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and a sense of orderly tranquility. We wanted boring. We craved predictable. For the first year, it was exactly that. We met the neighbors, went to the annual potluck, and dutifully paid our HOA dues. I learned about fertilizing schedules and the best time to plant perennials. I traded my armored vest for a gardening apron. Sarah started a book club. It was perfect. The first sign of trouble was subtle: an email from the HOA authored by its president, Karen Miller, reminding residents that holiday decorations could not be put up before the day after Thanksgiving and had to be removed by January 2nd. It was signed, "For a cohesive and harmonious community, Karen." It seemed silly but harmless. Then came the newsletter, a glossy 4-page affair that was less about community news and more about public shaming. A friendly reminder to the resident at 112 Primrose Lane that garbage receptacles are not to be visible from the street except on collection day. We've received complaints about a basketball hoop at 45 Blossom Court. Please remember that all such equipment must be stored out of sight when not in use. It was a monthly digest of petty grievances, all presented under Karen's smiling, heavily made-up photo. She ruled this tiny fiefdom with an iron fist and a laser-printed violation notice. My first direct interaction was over the color of our front door. The previous owners had painted it a tasteful, dark crimson. 3 months after we moved in, I got a letter. The color was unapproved. We were instructed to repaint it to one of the 3 approved shades of beige, brown, or off-white. I checked the bylaws. Sure enough, there it was, in an amendment passed 2 years prior. It was absurd, but I was new and wanted to keep the peace. I spent a weekend painting the door a color best described as sad sand. Karen drove by 3 times that Saturday, slowing her golf cart to a crawl to inspect my work. She didn't wave. She just nodded once, a queen approving of a serf's tribute, and drove on. That was when I started to file. Old habits die hard. I created a folder on my computer labeled HOA and saved the emails, the newsletters, and a photo of the freshly painted beige door. In my old job, we called it pattern of life analysis. Here it was just keeping track of the local tyrant. The flagpole was different. It wasn't a whim. My best friend and former partner in the DSS, a Marine named Dave, had been killed in an embassy bombing in Yemen 5 years earlier. The anniversary of his death was approaching, and I wanted to do something more than just raise a glass of whiskey to his memory. The flag was for him. It was for all the men and women standing watch on lonely walls around the world. It was a piece of my past that I needed to bring into my present. I didn't check the bylaws, I'll admit that. After 25 years of service to that flag, it never occurred to me that I would need permission from a suburban committee to fly it. I dug the hole, mixed the concrete, and set the pole myself. It was a clean, professional installation, perfectly plumb, and set back a respectful distance from the sidewalk. It looked right. It felt right. The next morning, Karen arrived. Her invasion of my property wasn't just a breach of protocol, it was a desecration. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor, she was an unauthorized element in a secure zone. My reaction, the walk, the flashlight, the countdown, wasn't anger. It was procedure. It was the muscle memory of 1,000 similar, albeit more dangerous encounters. You identify the threat, you establish the boundary, you issue a clear, non-negotiable directive. You control the situation. Her retreat was not a victory. It was simply the end of the initial engagement. Back in my kitchen, the coffee brewing, I opened my laptop and pulled up the HOA folder. I created a new document. Incident report. Karen Miller, trespassing and threats. I detailed the time, the date, her words, my actions. I took the clipboard she dropped and scanned the violation notice, adding it to the file. I then took her tape measure and placed it in a Ziploc bag, labeling it with the date and time. Evidence. It felt absurd, treating a neighborhood dispute like an international incident, but my training told me that the person who documents best wins. Karen had weaponized paperwork, but she was an amateur. I was a professional. She thought she was fighting over a flagpole. I was fighting for the principle that a man's home is his castle, not a diorama in someone else's dollhouse. I looked out the window at the flag, its colors vibrant against the blue sky. This wasn't just my fight. I had a feeling Karen had been bullying people in this neighborhood for a long time. It was time someone audited the books on her little kingdom. My peaceful retirement was officially over. Phase 1 was complete. The perimeter was secure. Phase 2 was about to begin. Reconnaissance and counterintelligence. The official declaration of war arrived 3 days later, delivered by a certified mail carrier who had the weary look of someone who frequently delivered bad news. It was a thick envelope, embossed with the Oakmont Estates HOA logo. Inside was a sheaf of papers that represented Karen's opening salvo. First, there was the official fine for the unauthorized flagpole, now doubled to $1,000 for failure to comply. Attached was a blurry photo of the pole, likely taken from her phone as she fled my property. Second, a new violation, hostile and threatening behavior by a resident, which carried another $500 fine. My use of the Maglite was described in hysterical prose, painting me as a deranged aggressor who had brandished a weapon-like object and verbally assaulted her. The third document was the most audacious. It was a formal notice that the board would be holding an emergency executive session to discuss my pattern of non-compliance and aggression, with my suspension of community privileges, the pool, the tennis courts, the clubhouse, as a potential outcome. The final page was a cease and desist letter drafted by the HOA's attorney, a firm named Abernathy, Finch and Associates. It demanded I remove the flagpole and have no further contact with President Miller, warning of further legal action, including a restraining order should I fail to comply. I spread the documents across my kitchen island, a mosaic of bureaucratic aggression. This was her strategy: overwhelm, intimidate, and bury the target in paperwork, assuming he'd either fold or make a rash mistake. She was counting on the average person's fear of lawyers and legal fees. I, however, was not the average person. I had worked with State Department lawyers to navigate the legal complexities of foreign sovereignty and international incidents. A letter from Abernathy, Finch, and Associates was small potatoes. My first call wasn't to a lawyer, it was to the local police department's non-emergency line. I filed a formal report against Karen Miller for trespassing. I gave the dispatcher my name, address, and a concise, dispassionate account of the incident. I noted that I had the event partially documented and had physical evidence, the clipboard and tape measure, that she had left behind on my property. The officer who came to my house an hour later was young, professional, and looked like he'd rather be doing anything else. "So, let me get this straight," he said, standing on my front porch, pointedly not stepping onto my property. "The president of your HOA came onto your lawn, you told her to leave, and she left. She entered my private property without permission, refused to leave when first instructed, and only left after I initiated a nonviolent escort procedure and began a countdown." I corrected him gently. "I have her on my doorbell camera entering the property. I did not threaten her. I informed her of her status as a trespasser." He sighed. "Sir, these HOA disputes, they're civil matters. We don't generally get involved unless there's an actual crime." "Trespassing is a crime," I stated plainly, "and according to her own letter, she's now falsely accusing me of assault and threatening behavior. I am making a formal record of my side of the story to counter her narrative." The officer, to his credit, took the report seriously. He took down my statement, photographed the clipboard and tape measure, and gave me a report number. He knew and I knew that it was unlikely to go anywhere. But that wasn't the point. The point was the report itself. It was now a public record. It was my official, time-stamped version of events, a defensive document to be deployed later. My second step was to start my own legal file. I meticulously scanned every page Karen had sent me. I wrote a detailed rebuttal to each point, citing the specific time of the trespassing incident and cross-referencing my police report number. I addressed the hostile behavior claim by stating I had used a flashlight on my own property to clearly illuminate the property line for an intruder who had refused verbal commands to leave. I defined the Maglite as a standard household illumination tool. Every word was chosen to be factual, unemotional, and legally precise. I then drove to the county courthouse. It wasn't to file a lawsuit, not yet. It was for reconnaissance. For a nominal fee, the clerk's office gave me access to their public records database. I spent the next 3 hours searching for two things: Oakmont Estates HOA and Karen Miller. The results were illuminating. The HOA had been a party in 7 lawsuits over the past 10 years. All were small claims cases brought by residents over fines, liens, or property disputes. The HOA had won 5 of them. The 2 they lost were because the residents had shown up with lawyers and clear documentation. A pattern emerged. The HOA preyed on those who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. The search on Karen Miller was even more interesting. She had 2 prior lawsuits of her own, both as a plaintiff in personal injury cases that were dismissed as frivolous. One was against a grocery store for a slippery floor with no witnesses, and the other was against a neighbor 2 houses ago for their dog's emotionally distressing barking. This wasn't her first time using threats and legal action to get her way. This was her modus operandi. I printed everything: the case files, the dismissals, the list of HOA lawsuits. When I left the courthouse, my briefcase was heavy with ammunition. Back home, I drafted my official response to the HOA's lawyer. It was polite, professional, and firm. I stated that the flagpole was a constitutionally protected expression of speech and patriotism, and that any attempt to force its removal would be met with a vigorous legal challenge. I stated that the fines were illegitimate as they stem from an illegal act of trespass committed by their client, President Miller, and that I had filed a police report to that effect. I included the report number. I concluded by stating that I considered their client's actions to be a form of harassment and that I would not be intimidated. I sent the letter via certified mail, return receipt requested. The paper trail was now a two-way street. Sarah watched me that evening, a worried frown on her face as I organized the files on the dining room table. "Jack, are you sure about this? Maybe we should just take the pole down. It's not worth all this trouble." I looked at her, then at the mountain of paper I was assembling. "This isn't about the pole anymore, Sarah. It's about a bully who has been running roughshod over this entire community. She pushed me. She thinks I'm just another homeowner she can scare into submission. She has no idea who I am or what I'm capable of." I picked up a copy of the HOA bylaws, a thick, spiral-bound book. She thinks this is her Bible and her shield. I'm going to show her that it's a cage of her own making, and I'm about to lock the door. The initial shock had passed. The strategic mind, the one honed in dusty outposts and tense diplomatic meetings, was now fully engaged. Karen had chosen the battlefield. I was about to choose the weapons. The battle of the letters continued for 2 weeks. A sterile exchange of certified mail that did little but enrich the U.S. Postal Service and the HOA's lawyers. My flagpole remained standing, a silent declaration of defiance, and the fines continued to accumulate in neatly typed invoices that I filed away in my growing dossier. Karen had ceased her direct patrols past my house, but I felt her presence everywhere, in the sudden chill from neighbors who now averted their eyes, in the whispers that stopped when I entered the community mailroom. She was poisoning the well, turning my quiet sanctuary into a hostile environment. It was time to move from defense to offense. My next target was the heart of Karen's power, the HOA's own governing documents and financial records. Under state law, as a homeowner, I had the right to inspect them. I drafted a formal request citing the specific state statute and sent it to the board, demanding access to all financial statements, meeting minutes, and vendor contracts for the past 5 years. This was a standard DSS tactic. When you suspect corruption, you follow the money. The predictable response came a week later. A letter from Abernathy, Finch and Associates stating that my request was overly broad and burdensome, and that I would need to schedule an appointment to view the documents in their office for a fee of $100 per hour for supervision. It was another stonewalling tactic designed to be just difficult and expensive enough to deter me. It wouldn't work. While waiting for the inevitable legal wrangling over the documents, I began my own neighborhood reconnaissance. I needed allies, or at least intelligence from the ground. I started with Mr. Henderson, an elderly widower who lived 2 doors down. He was a retired accountant in his late 80s, and his lawn was his pride and joy, a perfect carpet of green that he tended to with almost religious devotion. I'd often seen Karen's golf cart parked in front of his house. I found him one afternoon on his hands and knees, meticulously pulling a tiny weed from the edge of his driveway. "Mr. Henderson," I began, approaching slowly so as not to startle him. "Jack Turner from 214. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about our HOA." He looked up, his eyes clouded with a weariness that had nothing to do with his age. He got to his feet with a quiet groan. "It's about Karen, isn't it?" he said, his voice a dry whisper. "Heard she's got it in for you over that flagpole of yours." We talked for over an hour. It was like opening a floodgate. For 5 years, Karen had been tormenting him. It started with the height of his prize-winning azaleas, which were apparently 2 inches over the regulation 36 inches. Then it was the unapproved brand of mulch he used. Last year, he'd received a $200 fine because a small patch of his lawn had turned brown during a drought, a violation of the aesthetic maintenance clause. He had paid every fine, trimmed every bush, and replaced every offending item, too tired and too intimidated to fight. "She threatened to put a lien on my house," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "My wife, God rest her soul, loved this house. I couldn't bear the thought of some legal trouble hanging over it. So I just pay. It's easier to just pay." He told me about others. The young couple with a toddler who were fined because their child's plastic slide was visible over the fence line. The single mother who worked 2 jobs and was constantly cited for her garbage cans being put out an hour too early. It was a clear pattern of abuse, targeting the most vulnerable, the elderly, the young families, the people without the time or resources to fight back. Her power wasn't in the bylaws. It was in the targeted application of fear and exhaustion. I asked him if he would be willing to write down his experiences, to sign a sworn affidavit if it came to that. He hesitated, fear warring with a lifetime of pent-up frustration. "What good would it do?" he asked. "She has the lawyers. She has the board. They're all her friends." "The first step in dismantling an unjust power structure, Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice firm but kind, "is to create a record of its injustices. 1 voice is a complaint, a dozen voices is a movement." He looked over at my flagpole, then back at me. A spark of something I hadn't seen before flickered in his old eyes. "All right, son," he said, nodding slowly. "You tell me what you need." That conversation was a turning point. I spent the next week talking to other neighbors. the ones Mr. Henderson had mentioned. I approached them cautiously, not as a crusader, but as a fellow resident asking for advice. I listened to their stories of petty tyranny, of fines for oil stains on driveways no bigger than a quarter, of demands to power wash perfectly clean siding. Most were scared to talk, but a few, like the young couple with the plastic slide, were angry enough to cooperate. I collected 3 sworn affidavits, each one a testament to Karen's reign of terror. My file was no longer just about me. It was becoming a class action lawsuit in waiting. While I was building my coalition of the wronged, I was also digging into the HOA's corporate structure. Every HOA is a corporation, and every corporation has to be registered with the state. I went to the Secretary of State's website and pulled the corporate filings for Oakmont Estates. I found the original articles of incorporation, the list of board members, and the registered agent, the person legally designated to receive official correspondence. The registered agent was not Karen, nor was it the law firm. It was a former board member who had moved away 3 years ago. They had never updated it. This was more than a clerical error. It was a critical vulnerability. It meant that any legal notice sent to that old, out-of-date address was still considered legally served. More importantly, it was a sign of profound sloppiness. If they couldn't get this simple, legally required detail right, what other corners were they cutting? I felt a familiar thrill, the same one I'd get in the field when a source would inadvertently reveal a key piece of intelligence. Karen was so focused on the color of people's mailboxes that she had neglected the very foundation of her own authority. Her fortress was built on sand, and I had just found the first crack. The affidavits, the pattern of abuse, the corporate filing error. These were the pieces of the trap I was beginning to construct. I wasn't just going to fight a fine. I was going to dismantle the entire corrupt machine, piece by bureaucratic piece. And I was going to use Karen's own beloved rulebook to do it. The package from Abernathy, Finch & Associates regarding my document request was exactly the kind of arrogant misstep I had been counting on. Their demand for a supervised, fee-based review was a classic bully tactic, but it was also a violation of the state's Common Interest Development Act, which stipulated that a homeowner had the right to inspect records at a reasonable time and place, with costs limited to the direct expense of copying. Charging a supervision fee was illegal. This was the first piece of bait for my trap. I didn't write back to them. I didn't call. I let their illegal demands sit, unanswered, as proof of their intent to obstruct. The time for letters was over. It was time to bring in my own team. I made 3 phone calls. The recipients were not lawyers. They were ghosts from my past, men whose numbers were stored in my phone under innocuous code names Mike Plumber, Chris Electrician, and Ben Landscaper. They were, respectively, a former DSS cybersecurity expert, a technical surveillance countermeasures TSCM specialist, and a former Marine Force recon scout who had served as my lead advance agent on a dozen high-threat assignments. They were my brothers, the kind of men who would fly across the country on a day's notice if you said you were in a jam. "Jack, you old ghost," Ben's booming voice came over the line. "Don't tell me you're bored of retirement and want to go stir up trouble in some third-world hellhole." "Worse," I said dryly. "Suburbs. I've got an HOA problem." There was a pause, then a deep laugh. "Say no more. When do you need boots on the ground?" A week later, a nondescript Ford Transit van pulled into my driveway. Out stepped Mike, Chris, and Ben. They looked less like a tactical team and more like middle-aged dads on a weekend getaway, wearing cargo shorts, polo shirts, and sunglasses. But I saw the way their eyes scanned the street, clocking the cars, the houses, the sightlines. You can take the agent out of the service, but you can't take the service out of the agent. Sarah had baked cookies. She knew the drill. Over coffee and chocolate chips at my dining room table, which was now a makeshift command center covered in documents, I laid out the situation. "The target's name is Karen Miller," I began, pushing her photo across the table. "HOA president. Rules through intimidation and procedural attrition. We have documented cases of harassment, likely financial misconduct, and clear violations of state law." Ben picked up the photo, studying it. "Looks like a standard big fish, small pond type. All ego, easy to provoke." Chris, the quiet technician, was already looking at the HOA bylaws. Their rules on surveillance are vague. No permanent fixtures that infringe on a neighbor's privacy. That gives us a lot of room to work. Mike, the cyber guy, was tapping away on his laptop. HOA website is a joke. Off-the-shelf template, no security. Their members-only portal is protected by a password that's probably password 123. Give me an hour and I'll have their internal emails and financials without even breathing hard. No, I said firmly, holding up a hand. Everything we do is by the book, 100% legal. We are not them. We don't break laws to enforce them. Mike, your job is open source intelligence, social media, public records, web archives. Find her digital footprint. Chris, I want this house wired for sound and video, but everything has to be pointed at my property only. Overt, not covert. I want her to see the cameras. I want them to be a deterrent and a witness. Ben, you and I are going to do some old-fashioned human intelligence. For the next 2 days, my quiet suburban home was transformed. Chris, the electrician, installed a series of high-definition, professional-grade security cameras. They weren't the cheap consumer models. They were discreet but visible, placed under the eaves of the roof, covering every inch of my yard, my driveway, and my front porch. One was aimed directly at the flagpole. He wired them to a secure digital recorder in my office, a system that was tamper-proof and backed up to a cloud server. He also did a full sweep of my house and cars for bugs, a precaution that felt like overkill until Chris found a small GPS tracker tucked up under the rear bumper of Sarah's SUV. It was a cheap, commercially available model, the kind a suspicious spouse might use. But the battery was fresh. We photographed it, documented its location and serial number, and placed it in an evidence bag. Karen, or someone acting on her behalf, had just escalated from harassment to illegal surveillance. This was a felony. Ben, the landscaper, and I walked the neighborhood. We didn't talk about the HOA. We talked about lawn care, the weather, the local sports team. Ben had a disarming charm that could get a Trappist monk to spill his life story. Within a day, he had a complete social map of the neighborhood. Who was friends with Karen? Who despised her? Who sat on which committees? And who held the real, unofficial power? We learned that the HOA's treasurer, a man named Gary, was a meek individual completely under Karen's thumb. The secretary, another of Karen's cronies, owned a local printing company that, coincidentally, had the exclusive contract for printing the HOA's glossy newsletters and violation notices. Meanwhile, Mike was building a digital dossier from his laptop in my guest room. Karen's social media was a goldmine of hypocrisy. Posts about community standards next to photos of her own overgrown, weed-choked backyard from a few years prior. Rants about fiscal responsibility from a woman whose vacation photos from a recent cruise coincided perfectly with a large, vaguely described consulting fee paid by the HOA, which he found in a cached copy of a budget meeting agenda. He also discovered, through public property records, that Abernathy of Abernathy, Finch and Associates lived in a neighboring upscale development and was Karen's regular golf partner. It wasn't just a client relationship, it was a personal alliance. By the end of the second day, my file had tripled in size. It was no longer a collection of anecdotes. It was a structured intelligence product, complete with link analysis charts, financial timelines, and a gallery of potential co-conspirators. The arrival of my team did not go unnoticed. Karen's daily drive-bys resumed, this time in her Lexus instead of the golf cart. She'd slow down, her face a mask of suspicion, as she looked at the new cameras at the strange van in my driveway. She was trying to figure out what was happening, who these men were. She couldn't. We were outside her frame of reference. She expected an angry homeowner. She got a diplomatic security team running a full-spectrum counterintelligence operation on her little kingdom of beige. The GPS tracker was the final piece. It was the hard, undeniable evidence of criminal wrongdoing. I didn't call the police. Not yet. This was a trump card, and the time to play it had not yet arrived. The trap was now baited with her illegal demands, fortified with legal surveillance, and armed with evidence of a felony. All I had to do was wait for the target to make one more mistake, and I knew she would. Her ego wouldn't let her do anything else. Karen's next move was predictable in its arrogance, but shocking in its audacity. She interpreted my silence and the fortification of my home not as a sign of strength, but as a challenge to her authority. Her ego, pricked by the new cameras and the presence of my friends, demanded a show of force. She decided to bypass the paperwork and go for a direct physical assault on my property. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I was in my office with Mike, reviewing the digital architecture of the HOA's vendor payment system, when Ben's voice came over the small radio I'd given him. "Jack, we've got a flatbed tow truck turning onto our street. Big one. Looks like a heavy-duty repo rig." I walked to the front window and peered through the blinds. The truck, a massive, grimy beast with C&J towing emblazoned on the door, lumbered down our quiet lane. It slowed and then, with a hiss of air brakes, stopped directly in front of my house. My blood ran cold. She wasn't coming for the flagpole. She was coming for my truck. My truck was a lovingly restored 1985 Ford F-150. It was my weekend project, a piece of classic Americana that I kept in pristine condition. And it was parked in my own driveway, at least 20 feet from the street. Behind the tow truck, Karen's white Lexus pulled up. She got out, clipboard in hand, and marched over to the tow truck driver, a burly man with a greasy ponytail. She pointed at my Ford. I could see her mouth moving, her expression one of grim satisfaction. This was it, the gross overreach I had been waiting for. "Mike, you recording all this?" I asked, my voice calm. "4 angles, high definition," he replied without looking up from his screen. "Got audio from the porch cam," picking up her voice clearly. "Ben, what's your position?" I said into the radio. "Across the street, behind the hedges at 211. Got a clear view. Ready to provide witness testimony. Chris, stay inside, monitor the feeds. Nobody goes in or out." I walked to my front door, my mind a whirl of legal statutes and tactical options. A tow from private property without the owner's consent or a court order is illegal. This was grand theft auto, cloaked in the flimsy authority of an HOA bylaw. I stepped out onto the porch, letting the screen door click shut behind me. I didn't shout. I just stood there, arms crossed, watching them. The driver got out of his rig and started unspooling a heavy chain. Karen saw me and a triumphant smirk spread across her face. "Mr. Turner," she called out, her voice dripping with mock politeness, "as you know, you have several outstanding fines. Per Article 9, Section F of the bylaws, the association has the right to secure assets to cover delinquent accounts. This truck is being impounded until your balance of $2,500 is paid in full." "Karen," I said, my voice carrying easily in the still air, "what you are doing is illegal. That man is about to commit felony theft at your direction. I suggest you tell him to stop. Right now." The driver paused, looking from her to me, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was just a guy doing a job, likely fed a line of bull by Karen about her authority. "He's just trying to scare us," Karen snapped at the driver. "I have the paperwork. The HOA is fully authorized. Hook it up." The driver hesitated, then shrugged and continued toward my truck. That was the line. "Final warning," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "Stop what you're doing and leave the premises." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. I didn't have to fake the urgency in my voice. "My name is Jack Turner. I'm at 214 Rosewood Drive. There is a woman named Karen Miller and a tow truck driver from C&J Towing who are actively attempting to steal my vehicle from my private driveway. I have them on camera. I have warned them to stop. I need police assistance immediately." I kept the line open, putting the phone on speaker. The dispatcher's professional voice now filled the air. "Sir, can you confirm they are on your property?" "They are on my property, attempting to hook up my vehicle against my will. The vehicle is a blue 1985 Ford F-150. The tow company is C&J Towing." The sound of the dispatcher's voice had a galvanic effect. The driver dropped the chain as if it were red hot. He looked at Karen, his face now pale. "Lady, she said you had a court order." "The bylaws are as good as a court order," Karen insisted, but her voice had lost its conviction. She was staring at my phone, then at me, the full weight of what she had just done finally dawning on her. Committing a crime is one thing. Committing it while your victim is on a recorded 911 call is another level of stupid. "Dispatch, I have multiple video cameras recording the entire incident," I said into the phone. The subjects are still on the scene. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with astonishing speed. My quiet, boring suburb apparently had a very responsive police force when the words felony in progress were used. Two patrol cars screamed onto the street and blocked in both the tow truck and Karen's Lexus. Two officers got out, hands on their sidearms, their expressions all business. The lead officer, a tall, stern-looking sergeant, approached me first. "Sir, are you the one who called?" "I am, Sergeant," I said, ending the call. "That woman, Karen Miller, directed that man to tow my truck from my driveway to cover fictitious HOA fines." The sergeant turned to Karen. Her face had gone from smug to terrified. "Ma'am, did you order this vehicle to be towed?" The bylaws. He owes money," she stammered. "Do you have a writ of execution? A court order authorizing this seizure?" the sergeant asked, his voice flat. "No, but the HOA rules." "Then you are attempting to seize property without legal authority." The sergeant cut her off. He turned to the tow truck driver. You know better than this. Towing from private property without consent or a writ is grand theft. Give me your license." The driver looked like he was about to be sick. While the one officer dealt with him, the sergeant took my full statement. I showed him the footage on my phone. He watched the whole thing, his expression growing grimmer by the second. He walked over to Karen, who was now leaning against her car, looking utterly defeated. "Ma'am, based on the victim's statement and the video evidence, you are under arrest for attempted grand theft auto." The moment the handcuffs clicked onto Karen's wrists was a turning point for the entire neighborhood. Neighbors who had been peeking from behind their curtains were now drifting out onto their lawns. Mr. Henderson was standing on his porch, his mouth agape. The young couple with the toddler were at their window, holding their phone up to record. The Empress had no clothes and she was being led away in cuffs. The tow truck driver, after giving a frantic statement that he was just following Karen's orders and that she'd assured him it was legal, was also briefly detained and then released, pending charges, his truck impounded as evidence. As the police cars pulled away, taking a frantic and weeping Karen with them, a silence fell over Rosewood Drive. Then Mr. Henderson started to clap, just a slow, steady applause. Then the young couple joined in. Soon a half-dozen people were standing on their lawns, clapping, not for me, but for the simple, beautiful sight of justice being served. Ben walked up my driveway, a wide grin on his face. "You know," he said, "for the suburbs, this place has its moments." I looked at my old truck, safe in its spot. I looked at the faces of my neighbors, seeing hope where there had been fear. The trap had been sprung. Karen had walked right into it, but this wasn't the end. This was the event that would break the dam. This was the leverage I needed to burn her entire corrupt kingdom to the ground. The arrest was public, it was undeniable, and it was the catalyst for the revolution. The arrest of an HOA president in her own neighborhood in broad daylight for trying to steal a resident's truck is not something that stays quiet for long. The story spread through Oakmont Estates like wildfire. First as gossip, then as my doorbell camera footage was released by the police and picked up by a local news blogger as established fact. The video was devastating. It showed Karen, imperious and smug, ordering the tow. It captured my calm warnings, her contemptuous dismissal, and the final, beautiful moment of her crumbling realization as the police sergeant laid out the law. Overnight, the social dynamics of the community were completely upended. The fear that had kept everyone silent was shattered, replaced by a bubbling mixture of shock, anger, and a giddy sense of liberation. My phone started ringing. It was neighbors, some of whom I'd never spoken to, all with the same opening line. "I saw the video. Can I tell you what she did to me?" My home, once a command center for a covert operation, became the headquarters for a grassroots rebellion. Sarah set up a coffee station and put out plates of her cookies, turning our dining room into a makeshift crisis center. For 2 days, a steady stream of residents came to my door. I listened to each of their stories, with Ben taking quiet notes and Chris helping them scan their old violation notices and threatening letters into a central digital file. We heard from the family who was fined $1,000 and forced to tear out a beautiful, custom-built children's treehouse because it was aesthetically discordant. We heard from the Muslim family who was told their Eid decorations were inappropriate and had to be removed. We heard from a dozen people like Mr. Henderson who had been bled dry by 1,000 tiny cuts of fines for lawn maintenance, oil spots, and faded paint. What emerged was a staggering portrait of systemic abuse. Karen and her board hadn't just been enforcing rules, they had been running an extortion racket. The pattern was clear: target those least likely to fight back, levy exorbitant and often baseless fines, and then use the threat of a lien, a threat that could jeopardize a family's single largest asset, to force compliance. It was predatory, it was malicious, and with the volume of evidence we were now compiling, it was legally actionable. The most important visitor arrived on the second day. A young woman named Jessica, who lived on the other side of the community, introduced herself as a junior associate at a downtown law firm. "I'm a litigator, Mr. Turner," she said, shaking my hand firmly. "Or I'm trying to be. Mostly I do document review. I saw the video of Karen's arrest. My parents live here. She's been finding them for the last 3 years because the paint on their address numbers is peeling. I want to help. Pro bono." She was sharp, hungry, and she hated bullies. She was perfect. That evening we held a meeting. Not in the HOA clubhouse, which was enemy territory, but in my garage. We'd moved the Ford out onto the driveway, and I'd set up folding chairs. Over 20 people showed up, a cross-section of the communities wronged. I stood before them, my team, Ben, Chris, and Mike, standing behind me like a silent honor guard. Jessica, the young lawyer, stood beside me. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "For a long time, Karen Miller has maintained her power by isolating us. She made you feel like you were the only one, that your problem was unique, that you were the one at fault. Tonight, I want you to look around. You are not alone." I laid out everything I had discovered: the pattern of targeting the vulnerable, the financial discrepancies Mike had uncovered, the illegal surveillance, the conflict of interest with the HOA's law firm, the fatal flaw in their corporate registration. I presented it not as a rant, but as a case file, with facts, figures, and evidence. "Karen's arrest was just the beginning," I continued. "She's out on bail, and you can be sure she's plotting her revenge. The HOA's law firm is already trying to spin this as a misunderstanding. They will try to intimidate us back into silence. We cannot let that happen." Jessica then stepped forward. "Legally," she explained, "we have several avenues. We can pursue a class action lawsuit for the financial damages and harassment. We can file a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office regarding their fraudulent business practices. But our most powerful weapon is the one Karen herself gave us: the HOA's own bylaws and the annual meeting." The Oakmont Estates annual meeting was scheduled in 6 weeks. It was typically a sleepy affair, where Karen and her board would ram through a budget, pat themselves on the back, and re-elect themselves while most residents stayed home. "This year will be different," Jessica said, her voice ringing with passion. "The bylaws state that any member can add an item to the agenda with a petition signed by 5% of the homeowners. They also allow for a vote of no confidence to remove board members. We are not just going to attend the meeting, we are going to take it over." The mood in the garage shifted from anger to empowerment. For the first time, they had a leader, a plan, and a lawyer. Ben and Chris passed out clipboards with petitions. One to add a review of board conduct and finances to the agenda. The other, a vote of no confidence in Karen Miller and her entire board. We needed 64 signatures. We got over 100 that night. Mr. Henderson, his hand trembling with age but his signature firm and clear, was the first to sign. The alliance was forged. Our strategy was twofold. First, the legal pressure. Jessica would formally file the complaint with the Attorney General and begin drafting the class action suit. This would put the HOA's insurance carrier and their law firm on notice that we were serious. Second, the political campaign. We would go door to door, not just with petitions, but with information packets. Each packet contained a summary of our findings, a copy of the petition, and a proxy vote form for the annual meeting. We would gather enough proxy votes to ensure that even if our supporters couldn't attend, their votes would be counted. Mike built a simple, secure website, the OakmontJusticeProject.com, where we posted sanitized, non-libelous summaries of our findings and allowed residents to securely download the forms. Chris set up a group chat for us to coordinate our door-to-door efforts. It was a full-blown political campaign. run with the precision of a special operations mission. We divided the neighborhood into sectors, assigning teams to each one. I watched as Mr. Henderson, who had been too afraid to even speak up a few weeks ago, volunteered to lead the canvassing effort in his own cul-de-sac. The young couple who'd lost their treehouse designed a flyer with a simple, powerful message. It's our community. Let's take it back. Karen had built her empire on fear. We were dismantling it with something far more powerful, a united community armed with the truth. The battle for Oakmont Estates was heading for its final public showdown. The 6 weeks leading up to the annual HOA meeting were a masterclass in coordinated psychological and legal warfare. Our campaign, which we dubbed Operation Restore Oakmont, moved with relentless efficiency. While Karen was bogged down with her criminal charges for attempted grand theft, her trial date set for 3 months away, we seized the initiative and defined the narrative. Our first official move was to deliver the petitions to the HOA management office. I went myself, accompanied by Jessica and Mr. Henderson. We didn't mail them. We hand-delivered them to the office manager, a flustered woman who was clearly unprepared for our organized front. We had a third party, a licensed notary, accompany us to officially witness and document the delivery. This prevented them from later claiming they never received them. The petitions, bearing the signatures of nearly a quarter of the homeowners, legally compelled the board to add our items to the meeting's agenda, a full independent financial audit, and a vote of no confidence in the current board. The next phase was the information war. Karen and her remaining board members, the treasurer Gary and the secretary with the printing company, tried to counterattack. A special edition of the HOA newsletter came out, a piece of pure propaganda. It painted me as a dangerous radical who was sowing discord and trying to destroy the property values of the community. It referred to Karen's arrest as an unfortunate misunderstanding and warned residents against signing any misleading petitions. It was a clumsy defensive document, and it backfired spectacularly. Mike, our cyber expert, immediately did a cost analysis. He found the printer, the secretary's company, had charged the HOA 3 times the market rate for this emergency newsletter. He posted this information, along with the invoice he'd legally obtained through a new document request, on our Oakmont Justice Project website. The post, titled "Your HOA Dues at Work, Propaganda at Triple the Price," went viral within the community. Every time they tried to fight back, we used their own actions and our superior intelligence to turn it against them. Meanwhile, Jessica was launching legal torpedoes. She sent a formal notice to the HOA's insurance carrier, informing them of a pending class action lawsuit for gross negligence, harassment, and financial malfeasance on the part of the board. This is a crucial step. Insurance companies hate liability, and the notice put immense pressure on the board from their own financial backers. She also filed the official complaint with the State Attorney General's office, attaching over 30 sworn affidavits from residents. The AG's office responded within a week, opening a formal investigation into the Oakmont Estates HOA. The ground was crumbling beneath Karen's feet. My team continued their work in the background. Chris's cameras became an invaluable, silent witness. We captured footage of the secretary using the HOA's paid landscapers to do work on her private residence. We recorded Gary, the treasurer, making late-night trips to the clubhouse to shred documents, an act of spoliation of evidence that Jessica was delighted to learn about. Ben's human intelligence network was now so effective that we knew what the board was planning before they did. He learned from a disgruntled committee member that Karen was planning to use procedural tricks at the annual meeting to disqualify our proxy votes and shut down our agenda items. Forewarned is forearmed. Jessica drafted a sharp preemptive letter to the HOA's lawyer, citing the specific bylaws and state statutes governing proxy voting and meeting conduct. The letter essentially warned them that we were aware of their intended strategy and that any attempt to disenfranchise members would result in immediate legal sanctions against the board members personally. It was a checkmate move before the game had even begun. My role shifted from field operative to campaign manager. I spent my days coordinating the canvassers, talking to residents on the phone, and working with Jessica to refine our presentation for the meeting. The dining room table was now permanently covered in maps of the neighborhood, spreadsheets of proxy votes, and a storyboard of our planned presentation. We weren't just going to present facts. We were going to tell a story of abuse, corruption, and finally, redemption. One evening, Sarah came and stood behind me, placing her hands on my shoulders. "I haven't seen you this energized since your days in the service," she said softly. "I was worried this fight would exhaust you, but it seems to have given you a new purpose." I looked around the room at the evidence of a community coming together. In the DSS, we were always fighting for abstract ideas, diplomacy, national interest. It was important, but it was distant. This, this is different. This is for Mr. Henderson's garden. It's for that family's treehouse. It's for our home. The day before the meeting, we did a final tally. We had collected proxy votes from over half the residents. We had enough votes to remove the entire board, approve the independent audit, and elect a new slate of candidates that we had recruited. A retired CPA for treasurer, a paralegal for secretary, and Mr. Henderson, who had reluctantly but proudly agreed to serve as the new president. We had the numbers. We had the evidence. We had the law on our side. The trap was no longer just about catching Karen. It was about liberating an entire community. The annual meeting was set for 7 p.m. in the clubhouse ballroom. We planned to arrive early, not just to get seats, but to establish control of the environment. Ben, Chris, and Mike would act as our unofficial security and observation team. This wasn't just an HOA meeting anymore. It was a regime change. The evening of the annual meeting felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. The Oakmont Clubhouse, usually a place of quiet card games and book club meetings, was packed to capacity. We had urged our supporters to show up in person, and they had responded. The room was a sea of determined faces, a silent army that had, until now, been invisible. My team and I arrived an hour early. Ben, ever the advanced man, did a quiet walkthrough. He noted the layout, the exits, and the single microphone on the dais where the board sat. Chris set up a small, discreet camera on a tripod in the back, with the explicit permission of the management company to record the proceedings for archival purposes, our insurance against any later denial of what transpired. Mike was on his laptop, ready to project our evidence onto the large screen behind the dais, which was normally used for showing slides of the yard of the month. I stood near the entrance with Jessica and Mr. Henderson, greeting our supporters as they arrived. We handed each of them a simple one-page summary of the agenda and the key voting items. We were organized, professional, and calm. Karen and her board, Gary the treasurer and Brenda the secretary, arrived 30 minutes late, a deliberate power move to make the membership wait. They swept in, their faces tight with anxiety and false bravado. Karen, dressed in a severe black pantsuit, looked not at the crowd, but at me. Her eyes held a venomous promise of retribution. She still didn't get it. She thought this was a personal feud between the two of us. She didn't realize she was facing a unified front of 100 wrong families. The meeting began chaotically. Karen, acting as chair, tried to rush through the opening pleasantries and approve the previous year's minutes without discussion. Jessica immediately stood up. "Point of order, Madam President," she said, her voice clear and steady. "According to Robert's Rules of Order, which the bylaws designate as our governing procedure, a motion to approve the minutes is debatable." A murmur went through the crowd. Karen, flustered, shot a desperate look at the HOA's lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, who was sitting beside her. He whispered something to her. "Very well," Karen snapped. "Is there any debate?" I stood up. "Yes. I'd like to point out that the minutes from last year's meeting fail to reflect the dozen questions asked by residents regarding the landscaping overages in the budget, all of which were dismissed by the chair without an answer. The minutes as written are a fiction, and we cannot approve them." The crowd erupted in murmurs of agreement. The motion to approve the minutes failed spectacularly, the first blow of the night. Karen, her face turning a blotchy red, tried to move on, but Jessica was ready. "Point of order, Madam President. The next item on the agenda, as mandated by the petitions submitted and certified, is the motion for a full, independent financial audit." Karen tried to shut it down. "That motion is out of order. The board has already reviewed the finances and found them to be satisfactory." "That is not your decision to make," Jessica countered, her voice like ice. "It is the right of the membership to vote on this. Do you intend to illegally suppress a valid motion?" Abernathy, the lawyer, leaned over and whispered frantically to Karen. He knew they were on thin legal ice. Defeated, Karen had no choice but to allow the motion to be debated. This was my cue. "If I may," I said, walking to the front of the room, "my colleague will now present some information relevant to this motion." Mike dimmed the lights and his laptop screen was projected behind the board. The first slide was the invoice for the emergency newsletter, showing the triple cost charge from the company owned by Brenda, the board secretary. Brenda audibly gasped. The next slide was a summary of 5 years of landscaping contracts, showing a 200% increase in cost with no corresponding increase in services, alongside public records showing the owner of the landscaping company had co-signed a boat loan with Karen's husband. The room was filled with gasps and angry shouts. We presented slide after slide: the consulting fee that matched Karen's cruise, the receipts for the clubhouse redecoration that included several expensive items Mike had traced to an online auction site, sold from an account linked to Karen's home address. We weren't just showing numbers. We were showing undeniable proof of self-dealing and embezzlement. When Mike finished, there was a stunned silence. I stepped forward again. "This is why we need an independent audit," I said simply. "Our money has been treated like their personal slush fund. All in favor of the motion for a full, binding, independent audit, please say aye." The roar of "A" was deafening. It was a primal scream of a community that had been cheated and was now taking its power back. The nay vote from the 3 board members was a pathetic, unheard squeak. The motion passed. The final item was the vote of no confidence. Jessica stood to make the motion. "I move for a vote of no confidence and the immediate removal of President Karen Miller, Treasurer Gary Smith, and Secretary Brenda Lowe for gross negligence, financial malfeasance, and a pattern of harassment against the members of this association." Before Karen could even respond, Mr. Henderson, who had been sitting quietly, stood up. He walked slowly to the microphone, his hands trembling slightly, but his voice when he spoke was strong. "My name is George Henderson. I have lived here for 22 years. For the last 5 years, I have been afraid. Afraid to plant a flower, afraid of a brown patch on my lawn, afraid of the next letter in the mail. This woman," he said, pointing a shaking finger at Karen, "took the joy out of my home. She used our rules not to build a community, but to tear people down. I am not afraid anymore. I second the motion." The room erupted. People were on their feet, applauding. The vote was a mere formality. One by one, we called the names from our proxy list, our votes combining with the voices in the room to form an overwhelming tidal wave. The motion to remove the board passed with over 80% of the vote. Karen sat there, her face a blank mask of shock, her little kingdom of beige and beigeur dismantled in less than an hour. Her lawyer was already packing his briefcase, trying to distance himself from the toxic fallout. The fight was over. We had won. As the meeting broke up, people were hugging, laughing, and shaking my hand, but my eyes were on Karen. She was being approached by 2 uniformed police officers who had been discreetly standing in the back of the room. The DA's office, prompted by the AG's investigation and our evidence packet, had decided not to wait for the audit. Based on the evidence of embezzlement, they had issued a warrant. I watched as the officers spoke to her quietly, and for the second time in as many months, Karen Miller was placed in handcuffs. This time, it wasn't for trying to steal a truck. It was for the systematic theft of her neighbors' trust and their money. The Empress had not only lost her clothes, she had lost her castle, and now she was about to lose her freedom. The aftermath of the annual meeting was swift and decisive. With the old board removed, we held an immediate special election, as per the bylaws. The slate of candidates we had prepared was voted in unanimously. Mr. Henderson, looking both terrified and immensely proud, was officially the new president of the Oakmont Estates HOA. The retired CPA, a sharp woman named Maria, became the treasurer, and Jessica, the young lawyer who had been our champion, agreed to serve as secretary. Their first official act was to fire Abernathy, Finch and Associates. Their second was to formally engage the independent auditing firm. The community, so long fractured by fear and suspicion, began to heal. The atmosphere changed almost overnight. People started talking to each other again. Neighbors who had been avoiding eye contact were now stopping to chat on the sidewalk. There was a community barbecue the following weekend. the first one in years that felt like a celebration rather than a command performance. The young family who had been forced to tear down their treehouse started rebuilding it, and this time, a half-dozen neighbors showed up with hammers and saws to help. The legal fallout for the old board was severe. The audit, when it was completed, uncovered over $200,000 in misappropriated funds, fraudulent invoices, and outright theft over a 5-year period. Armed with this forensic evidence, the district attorney's case against Karen became ironclad. She was facing multiple felony charges for embezzlement and fraud, in addition to her pending trial for attempted grand theft. Her cronies, Gary and Brenda, facing their own legal jeopardy, quickly turned state's evidence, agreeing to testify against Karen in exchange for lesser charges. Brenda's printing company was sued by the HOA, now under Mr. Henderson's leadership, and we won a judgment that clawed back every cent she had overcharged the community. Karen's world had completely imploded. Buried in legal fees, she was forced to sell her house, the very house from which she had lorded over the neighborhood, to pay her lawyers. The day the for sale sign went up on her lawn was a quiet holiday in Oakmont Estates. My team, my old DSS brothers, had packed up their van the day after the meeting. We stood in my driveway as they prepared to leave. "Well, Jack," Ben said, clapping me on the shoulder, "I have to admit, this was one of the most satisfying domestic operations I've ever been a part of. You took down a dictator without firing a single shot." "All we did was help people find their voice," I said, looking around at the peaceful street. "And a good lawyer," Chris added with a rare smile. Mike just nodded. "The data trail never lies." We shook hands, a bond forged in foreign war zones and reaffirmed in the placid battleground of American suburbia. As they drove away, I felt a profound sense of peace. My war was over. The new HOA board, led by the gentle but firm hand of Mr. Henderson, immediately went to work rewriting the rules. They held town halls soliciting input from residents. The new bylaws were simplified, focused on safety and structural integrity rather than aesthetic tyranny. The fine system was overhauled, with warnings and friendly conversations replacing immediate financial penalties. The power was returned from the board to the community. Jessica, energized by the victory, decided to specialize in homeowners' rights law, and our case became her first big win, launching a career dedicated to fighting HOA overreach. A few months later, I was out in my yard, pruning the same rose bushes I had been tending to on that fateful morning when Karen first trespassed on my property. Mr. Henderson walked by, pushing a wheelbarrow full of fresh mulch, any brand he wanted. "Morning, Jack," he said, a genuine smile on his face. "Flag's looking good." I looked up at the flag, waving in the breeze from its pole. It was no longer a symbol of defiance. It was just a flag, a tribute to a fallen friend, flying freely in a community that had remembered what it meant to be neighbors. My perimeter was finally secure, not because of cameras or legal files, but because it was surrounded by a community of good people who had learned to stand together. The quiet, boring retirement I had sought was gone, replaced by something far better, a hard-won peace and a true sense of belonging. I picked up my clippers and got back to work, the snip of the blades the only sound in the calm morning air. The war was over, justice had been served, and my roses had never looked better.